Hi, everybody. My name is Boris, and I'm tech lead at Wix. And today I start by telling you a story. So a few years back, my team started working on a first project that used React after a few years of doing Angular. And just like many of React developers, even to this day, we were faced with this crucial destiny-changing, altering dilemma of which state management library should we be using. And of course, the obvious options were Redux and Mobex. And so we began our journey for the answer by gathering the whole team and having a discussion. But we quickly discovered that basically none of us had any experience with React, let alone one of those libraries. And so what we decided to do is basically spread out, do our individual researches, and then reconvene in order to make the actual decision. But then we remembered that we actually worked at Wix, full of super talented, genius people, and many of whom actually had the experience we were lacking, right? They did work with React. And so what we decided to do is like gather a council that will actually help us make the decision. The problem was that we actually ended up with so many opinions and so much data that we really had a hard time wrapping our heads around that. And so what we ended up doing is actually creating a decision matrix that will help us make the decision. The problem was that this whole debacle took us 2.5 weeks, right? And all the while, we haven't written a single line of code. And why? Well, because in our mind, this decision was so critical that it had to be made right there and then. Like, we've seen no way for us to build a React application without a state management library, right? Because this is what everybody was talking about. And the way we saw it is that if we were have gotten that wrong, we would be stuck and be paying for this mistake forever and ever. And we were wrong. Because to this day, after more than a dozen of React-based applications of various complexities, that application is the only one that uses any state management library. Because humans, when faced with a decision to be made, usually we see only two outcomes, right? Two categories of outcome. We are either getting it right or getting it wrong. But the problem is that the stress of getting it wrong actually blinds us from the fact that we usually are missing crucial pieces of information to make that decision. Okay? Just guesses. And so today I'm here to tell you that in cases where you don't know whether the decision you're making is right or wrong, there is a third option. And the third option is to postpone the decision as long as you can in order to gain more information. Otherwise, that decision can have crippling implications on your project. So let's start by talking about why we should be postponing our decisions. So usually, when you start working on a project or an application, right, you usually have some sort of architectural review, a design review with your teammates. And the question is why, right? And I think that the reason is rooted in this definition by Martin Fowler of what architecture really is. And he basically defines that architecture are decisions that we wished we were gotten right early on. And why is that important? Well, because decisions made early on are harder to revert, and they serve as a foundation for the rest of the application we're going to build. So the conclusion here is actually that the more decisions we make early on, the bigger the impact they will have on our code. And yet, whenever we start any kind of application, we usually start by stressing ourselves with tons of decisions to be made. Which framework to use? Should we use CSS in JS or Sass? Which database? How many node modules will we have? And so on and so forth. But the question is, are all those questions architectural, right? Should all of them be made at the beginning of the project? Because the truth is, like, the decisions we make at the beginning are usually not based on facts, right? Most of them are guesses. So what are they based on? Well, they can be based on various things, right? They, for example, can be based on hype. So I've seen some talk, I've read some blogs, some tweets about this cool new thing, and now I'm super eager to use it. They can be based on biases. Perhaps in past, I've tried some approach or some tech, and it ended up being a disaster, and now I'm completely against using it ever again. It can also be based on, on ego. How many of you have been part of discussions where somebody actually treated it as a competition and all they wanted to do is win? It doesn't matter if they were right or wrong. No, the other reason is that I think if there is one thing front-end developers love to do is NPM installing stuff, right? This is basically warms our heart. Because it gives us the bragging rights, right? We like telling our friends that we got to use this new thing. But most importantly, I think we love the feeling of instantly solving a problem, right? You are faced with some issue in your code, you npm install some package, boom, the problem is solved, and you are a hero for a day. But what about the performance penalty? What about the onboarding that is now way more complex? And most importantly, how can you be sure that this thing you just installed at the beginning of the project is actually the right tool for the job? And one of the reasons that it can be a wrong tool for the job is this thing. This is called the hype cycle, right? You can look it up in Wikipedia. And basically, this graph describes various stages of hype that each technology goes through, right? So first, the technology is being erected, right? It comes into existence. And then it's being discovered by early adopters, right? Some influencers who basically start blogging and giving talks and doing demos and all that kind of stuff, and basically getting more and more people on the hype wagon, saying like it's the best thing ever. But then, as time goes by, maybe critical issues are discovered, right? Maybe I don't know. So maybe it doesn't deliver on its promise, right? And then people basically abandon the technology. And while it dwells in this pit of disillusion, maybe it's being improved, maybe it's being discovered by new audiences who actually find more suitable use cases for it. And only then, after all that time, does it actually become useful. So the conclusion is the more we postpone an adoption of a technology, the higher the chance that we're actually picking a right solution for our problem. Unfortunately, requirements change, right? This is the unfortunate reality of our existence as developers. The problem here is that the code we write, our architecture or design, should actually be optimized for those requirements. So the more we delay decisions, the more basically we will give time for those requirements to stabilize, and the higher the chance that actually our code will be better suited to support them. So given our inability to predict the future, and given the fact that we usually don't know whether the decision we're making is right or wrong in our code, our best option in those cases is basically no decision, right? This is the best decision we can make. Because then we will basically allow ourselves to gain more information before we actually make it. And as long as you don't make those decisions after an optimal date, this will be our safest option. So next, let's talk about some things you can defer. So let's start at the very beginning, right? So at the beginning of your feature, somebody approaches you, and then they ask you, how long will this thing take? Right? And what do you usually do? Same as you just give out a random number, right? I feel like 3, maybe 4, I don't know. That's cool, right? You get people off your back. But the problem is that those estimations are fake, right? And fake estimations lead to fake deadlines. And fake deadlines lead to late delivery, which then leads to suffering. So we should try to base those estimations on some facts, right, and not guesses. And we will talk about some things we could do to improve that. I love this quote by Dan Abramov. He's talking about state management libraries. Like, now, you don't go buying glasses before you had trouble reading, or I don't know, before you started waving at random people on the street. Same goes for any kind of library, right? Before you npm install something, you should first encounter a need that library potentially solves, right? And even afterwards, you should see if there is a simpler solution within your code. And then you should also ask whether or not it's an actual issue or a design problem, right? Because in our case, whenever we thought that for reaching for a state management library, it was actually a design issue, and using simple techniques like lifting states or using tools provided by React, like context, usually solved the problem for us. And I think today it's even more so because of hooks. No, I think many of us, for better or for worse, are library developers at heart, right? Are open source developers at heart. And that's awesome. But I think on our day-to-day lives, this basically manifests in our love for creating super generic Swiss knives, one-size-fit-all abstractions, right? If maybe React component or just functions, right? That should solve world hunger and so on. And most importantly, keep our code dry, right? Without repetitions. But if you create those abstractions prematurely, how can you even be sure that you're actually covering all the use cases? How do you know if there are other people on your team that are facing the same problem? Are you solving their problem? Okay? And there are competing solutions in your code already that you can use? Those are the questions that you should be asking before creating any kind of abstraction, right? You should first understand the use cases it needs to handle, right? You should understand how the code is being used before wrapping it in a nice abstraction. One of the rules that I like to follow is something called the rule of 3, which basically states that you should wait for a third copy of the code in order to have a better understanding of the use cases and the API. One of the biggest fears that I have is to see my code deteriorate into something called a big ball of mud, right? Which basically means that my whole app is just a big pile of crap, of tightly coupled code, unpredictable code. And I think that this fear actually leads us into reaching for like heavy guns and heavy tools. Namely, immediately breaking our application into tons of node modules, breaking it into microservices or micro frontends. And this has a lot of benefits, right? Because what this creates is basically this impenetrable wall between various parts of our application that actually allows us to control how each part interacts with another. This also comes at a cost, right? Namely, that now integration testing is a nightmare. The deployment of our application is super hard, and the ownership of each part becomes super vague, right? But most importantly is, how can you even know that the boundaries that you have created in your code at the beginning are actually correct? So we should wait to gain more understanding about our organizational and business domain before we create hard abstractions, hard boundaries, because otherwise it will be super hard for us to evolve them and change them when things actually change. So the problem with deferring decisions is that it introduces uncertainty, right? And uncertainty introduces stress. And what will be super helpful is if we could turn the postponing of decisions into like an actual process. A process that will help us, A, understand whether or not we should be deferring a certain decision, then define when will that decision be made, and hopefully allow us to revert it if something went wrong. And I'd like to show you one of the processes that you could be using. It's called real options. It's a concept ported to software from finances. And basically, it's defined as follows. It's the right, but not the obligation, to take some action prior to expiration. Now, this sounds like a huge mouthful. So let's see an example from our day-to-day lives. I've recently visited Japan, which was unfortunately hit by a large typhoon. And what was really useful is that I've booked some of the hotels with free cancellation option. So basically what I've done is I've paid extra in order to create an option for myself to decide at a later date whether I'm going or not. Now, if I were to cancel it prior to the defined date, I'm basically losing nothing. And if I will simply not show up, I will lose the whole booking fee. A more technical example for real options is feature toggles or feature killers, A/B testing systems. Basically, what they allow me is to deploy my code to production and decide later whether or not my code will run in production, who are the population that will be exposed to that code, and it will also allow me to turn that code off in case something goes wrong and do it remotely. Now, Chris Matt, a guy who invented basically real options, goes on to define them using 3 key principles. The first principle is that every option has a value. Okay? And that makes sense, right? The fact that I can decide something later on has a value for me, right? And that value is determined by the amount of uncertainty and, of course, the cost of creating that option. The second principle is that every option expires, right? So if I will basically delay my decision too much, a certain option will become unavailable to me and I cannot utilize it. And the third principle states that you should never commit early unless you know why. So what real options basically give us is reduced stress when delaying decision. Because first of all, instead of just saying I will postpone it indefinitely, we are forced to define a condition when the decision will be made. Now, this condition can be anything, right? It can be a date or perhaps a discovery of a missing part of information. It also forces me to think whether or not I should be delaying the decision, right? Because if the value of an option is low, perhaps because it's easily revertible or the decision is very low impact, there is no point in me deferring the decision, right? I can just make it right there and then. And most importantly, I think it forces us to gain and keep seeking for more information before the decision is actually made. So now let's see some things that we can do in our code in order to create options for ourselves. Gleb had an awesome talk about testing, and I'd like to reiterate how important testing is. So I will talk about TDD, test-driven development, which is basically a software development process that states that you should first write the test and only then write the code that will make that test pass. And when you do that, you should make no assumptions about the code and write the minimal and the simplest code that will make that test pass. Now, what that gives me is basically, it forces me to make no assumptions about the code, about the implementation, and it also prevents me from over-engineering, right, based on guesses. And once the test passes, I now have a safety net that basically allows me to revert my decision and to change my mind if I choose to do so. But I will know for a fact that my unit or the whole system still functions. The next thing is Spike. Now, Spike is basically a potentially throwaway code that we are writing in order to explore a potential solution to a problem we're facing, right? And what that gives us is basically it allows us to gain more knowledge about the technical and the business domain, and that comes really useful when we are forced to give estimations, right? Because now, instead of just guessing stuff, we can sketch some code and gain more knowledge and then give away more accurate estimates, right? This is also super useful when you're thinking of adopting a technology, right? Because now you have a concrete problem, and you can take that technology and try to solve that problem with the technology, right? Instead of just playing with it in the code sandbox, for example. Now, this sounds like a little bit of a waste, but it pays off really quickly. So boundaries are important, right? I think we all agree, right? But the problem is that we've discussed that if we'll just split things immediately into node modules, and those boundaries are incorrect, it will be practically impossible or very, very costly for you to basically change those boundaries later, right? So a concept of modular monolith actually comes really handy, okay? And it's basically defined as follows, right? Basically, the idea is that your whole project is basically one big code base, right? It's a one code project that is basically divided into folders. Again, not node modules, just folders. Each folder is a business unit, right? One that handles billing, for example, one that handles users, orders, whatever it may be. And each folder has a file that defines its public API, right? Think about, I don't know, an index.js that basically exports all the public functions that we want to allow other parts, other components to be using, right? Now, this is still one code project, so basically other folders can import whatever they like. So this is where tooling comes in handy, because you can use stuff like linters, custom rules to enforce that basically the public API of each component is the only thing being used, okay? So what that gives us is basically it gives us the same boundaries, but it allows us to evolve them easily. So postponing decisions is useful, but like everything in life, it comes at a cost, and we need to be aware of those costs. So as we discussed earlier, if you postpone a decision for too long, you may lose viable options, right? Viable solutions. One of them perhaps may be an optimal answer to your question. So we need to be really careful. If you're part of a team that makes the decisions, right, and you're postponing something, it can not only affect your team, but it can also get other teams that depend on you to get stuck, right? For example, if you're creating something that should be consumed by others. And you need to be really aware of that as well. Now, in order to be able to postpone decisions and create options, that means that our code needs to be flexible and easily changeable. And that, unfortunately, usually means that it becomes way more complex. Okay? And you need to be thinking whether or not it's a cost you're willing to pay. And finally, it's stressful. Okay? And if you are postponing too many decisions, it may cause you to make rash decisions just to get rid of the headache, right? To make real suboptimal decisions. So here are a couple of takeaways that I'd like to leave you with. You should never commit early unless you know why. You should always ask yourself whether you have enough information to make the decision right there and then. And if you will choose to postpone your decision, you need to create options for yourself using stuff, for example, like Modular Monolith or testing, which is also great. And of course, be aware of the costs and think of them constantly. That's it. Happy procrastinating, people. Thank you.
Boris Litvinsky, thank you so much. And we have some questions for you, Boris. You said that you like them, so that's a good thing. Do you use micro-fronted? What do you think about this hype?
I think, just like everything, it's a tool for specific tasks. They're super costly. We use them on several products, but basically it comes super handy if you want to have one app and have different teams be basically owners of different part of that app and have them move quickly. This is what we use it for. So imagine an app, a team responsible for a certain page, and they want to deploy that page independently without basically deploying the whole app. So this comes super handy. We're using it. Again, it's a solution for a particular problem. Okay, that's all there is to it.
What kind of services do you use for feature toggles?
Yeah, so we have basically our own system called Petri. It's open source, Wix, GitHub, Wix /Petri. I will tweet out the link. Again, you can A/B test stuff. You can just use it for feature toggles. Super awesome. Use it, open source. You're welcome.
And the last question, are you using canary testing for decision making?
Yes, sometimes. Mostly our products do it. It's an effective tool, and yeah, like we do use them occasionally.
And then I have a question, Rick and Morty, which one is your spirit animal?
Both of them, of course.
Both of them.
You cannot discriminate, come on.
See, he doesn't make a decision. He's going to make a deferred decision about this later, I think.
Never.
All right, this was Boris Litvinsky. Thank you so much. If you have more questions for him, make sure you catch him